In the autumn of 1998, in a peaceful suburb of Grand Rapids, Michigan, a family's life changed forever. A newly married woman vanished on her honeymoon without a trace, leaving investigators with absolutely no answers. The mystery remained unsolved for decades, casting a long, dark shadow over everyone who loved her. But 26 years later, one small detail reopened the case. A single family photo revealed a truth no one was prepared for. Clara Linwood was the kind of person who seemed to bring a quiet warmth into any room she entered. At 24 years old, she had a gentle spirit, a soft laugh, and a deeply nurturing personality that made her the emotional anchor of her family. She worked as an archivist at a local historical library, spending her days surrounded by old photographs, dusty records, and forgotten stories. She loved the quiet stability of her life. Clara was never one for wild adventures or unpredictable risks. She liked knowing what tomorrow would bring. More than anything, Clara was devoted to her younger sister, Beatrice. Though they were 4 years apart, they were inseparable. Growing up in their modest home in Michigan, they had shared a bedroom, shared their secrets, and built a bond that felt entirely unbreakable. Beatrice looked up to Clara as a protector and a guide. If Beatrice ever had a bad day, Clara was the one who would sit on the edge of her bed, listening for hours until the tears stopped. They had a promise, made when they were just children, that no matter where life took them, they would always look out for each other. Because Clara was so cautious and methodical, her family was genuinely surprised when she was swept up in a whirlwind romance. It happened during a rainy afternoon in the spring of 1997. A water pipe had burst in the basement of the library where Clara worked, and a local contracting company was called in to assess the damage. The man leading the crew was Julian Vance. Julian was 28, charming, confident, and incredibly charismatic. He had a way of speaking that made the person he was talking to feel like they were the only one in the room. He was tall, with a bright smile and an easygoing nature that completely disarmed Clara's usual shyness. He asked her out for coffee that very afternoon. To everyone's surprise, she said yes. From the outside, their relationship looked like a fairy tale. Julian showered Clara with attention. He bought her flowers for no reason, took her on surprise weekend trips to the lake, and cooked elaborate dinners for her parents. The Linwood family adored him. He seemed stable, hardworking, and deeply in love with their daughter. Beatrice, too, thought Julian was wonderful, though she sometimes felt a tiny, unexplainable flicker of unease. Things were moving incredibly fast. Clara, who usually took months to make simple decisions about buying a new car or changing her hairstyle, was suddenly talking about moving in with Julian after only 3 months of dating. By the time they had been together for 6 months, Julian proposed. He rented out a beautiful restaurant downtown, got down on one knee, and presented her with a stunning diamond ring. Clara said yes through tears of joy. The wedding was set for the following October. As the wedding planning consumed their lives, Beatrice noticed subtle changes in her older sister. Clara started calling less frequently. When they did talk, Clara sounded tired, often distracted. Julian was always in the background, sometimes answering Clara's phone or speaking for her when her family asked questions. Beatrice brushed it off as wedding stress. Planning a massive event for 200 guests was exhausting, and Clara had always been a perfectionist. The morning of the wedding, October 10, 1998, was crisp and beautiful. The autumn leaves in Michigan were a brilliant gold and crimson, and the air was perfectly clear. Inside the bridal suite of the local church, Clara sat in front of a large mirror while Beatrice helped her pin her veil. Clara looked absolutely breathtaking in her white lace gown. Around her neck, she wore a heavy silver locket. It was an antique heirloom given to her by their late grandmother, a piece of jewelry Clara wore every single day. She had always said it made her feel safe. But as Beatrice stood behind her sister, adjusting the delicate lace of the veil, she looked at Clara's reflection in the mirror. Clara wasn't smiling. She was staring at her own reflection with an expression that Beatrice couldn't quite understand. It wasn't the nervous excitement of a bride. It looked, just for a fleeting second, like sheer dread. Her eyes were wide, her breathing shallow. Beatrice placed a hand on Clara's shoulder and asked if she was okay. Clara blinked, the heavy expression instantly vanishing, replaced by a bright, reassuring smile. She told Beatrice she was just overwhelmed with happiness, just dealing with some last-minute butterflies. Beatrice squeezed her shoulder, believing the lie because she wanted to. A few minutes later, the music started, and Clara walked down the aisle to marry Julian Vance. The reception was a joyous celebration. Julian gave a touching speech about how Clara was the light of his life, promising to protect her forever. They danced, they laughed, and as the night came to an end, they drove off under a shower of sparklers. They were headed south, driving down to the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee for a 2-week honeymoon in an isolated, romantic cabin. The first 2 days of the honeymoon seemed perfectly normal. Clara called her parents' house from a payphone in the tourist town of Gatlinburg on Monday afternoon. She sounded happy, describing the beautiful mountain views, the crisp mountain air, and the cozy log cabin Julian had rented. It sat deep in the woods, at the end of a long gravel road, surrounded by towering pine trees and sitting just a few hundred yards from a fast-moving river. Clara told Beatrice they were going to spend the next few days hiking and exploring the scenic trails. But on Tuesday evening, when Clara called again, her tone was different. The call was brief, barely 2 minutes long. She told Beatrice that the cabin was very isolated, maybe a little too isolated for her liking. Her voice was quiet, almost hushed, as if she was trying not to be overheard. When Beatrice asked what they had done that day, Clara gave vague answers. Before Beatrice could press further, Clara said Julian was calling her from the other room and she had to go. She promised to call again on Wednesday. Wednesday came and went without a phone call. Beatrice felt a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach, but her parents reassured her. They were on their honeymoon, they said. They were probably just enjoying their privacy, or maybe they had gone on a long hike and lost track of time. There was no reason to panic over one missed phone call. Then came Thursday, October 14th, 1998. It was just past 2 in the morning when the landline phone at the Linwood house began to ring. In the dead of night, a ringing phone always feels like a siren. Beatrice woke up instantly, her heart pounding against her ribs. She heard her father's heavy footsteps rushing down the hallway to answer it. A moment later, she heard her father's voice, thick with sleep, say hello. Then a long, agonizing silence filled the house. Beatrice crept out of her room and stood at the top of the stairs. She could see her father in the kitchen, gripping the phone receiver tightly. His face had drained of all color. His hand was shaking violently. He asked, in a voice so fragile it barely sounded like his own, to repeat what had just been said. It was Julian on the other end of the line. He was hysterical, sobbing so hard he could barely form coherent sentences. He was calling from the local sheriff's office in Tennessee. Clara was gone. According to Julian, they had woken up early on Wednesday morning to watch the sunrise. Julian had decided to drive down the mountain into town to grab some fresh coffee and breakfast from a local bakery, leaving Clara at the cabin. She had told him she wanted to stay behind and take a short walk along the river behind the property to take some photographs of the morning mist. Julian claimed he was gone for about 2 hours. When he returned to the cabin, the front door was unlocked. The coffee he had bought went cold on the kitchen counter as he searched the property. He called her name, walking the perimeter of the cabin, checking the immediate trails. He thought maybe she had just wandered a bit further down the river path. But as the hours ticked by, the dense mountain woods remained completely silent. By late afternoon, panic had set in. Julian had driven back into town and alerted the local authorities. A search party had been organized before sunset, combing the woods behind the cabin, calling out Clara's name into the fading light. But they found nothing. She had vanished into the immense, unforgiving wilderness of the Smoky Mountains. The news hit the Linwood family like a physical blow. Beatrice collapsed on the stairs, unable to breathe as her mother began to scream. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. Clara was terrified of getting lost. She had zero survival skills, hated walking in the woods alone, and would never, under any circumstances, wander off the marked path. The idea of her taking a solitary walk in unfamiliar, dense woods along a dangerous river went entirely against her nature. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. By sunrise, Beatrice and her parents were in their car, driving frantically toward Tennessee. The 10-hour drive felt like an eternity. The entire way, Beatrice stared out the window, praying that this was all a massive misunderstanding. She envisioned arriving at the sheriff's station to find Clara sitting there with a sprained ankle, wrapped in a blanket, apologizing for causing such a scare. But when they finally arrived at the command center set up near the cabin, the grim reality of the situation crashed down on them. The command center was swarming with search and rescue teams, tracking dogs and local police. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. The woods surrounding the cabin were vast, steep, and treacherous. The river that ran behind the property was swollen from recent autumn rains, the water icy and violent as it rushed over jagged rocks. Detective Elias Thorne, a seasoned investigator with a calm but weary demeanor, met the family as they pulled up. He gently guided them away from the chaotic staging area and brought them to a quiet tent. He looked at Beatrice and her parents with a deeply sympathetic expression, the kind of look a detective gives when they are preparing a family for the worst possible news. The search dogs had tracked Clara's scent from the back porch of the cabin, down a steep, muddy embankment, and directly to the edge of the roaring river. The scent stopped abruptly at the water's edge. But the dogs hadn't just found a scent. Detective Thorne reached into a plastic evidence bag and placed an item on the folding table in front of them. It was Clara's bright yellow windbreaker, the same jacket she had been wearing when she left Michigan. It was soaked through, stained with dark river mud, and torn at the shoulder. They had found it snagged on a sharp branch hanging over the deepest, fastest section of the rapids. Beatrice stared at the muddy yellow fabric, her chest tight with an unbearable panic. The police were already forming a theory. They believed Clara had slipped on the wet moss near the edge of the water, tumbled into the freezing river, and been swept away by the violent current. But as Beatrice looked closer at the jacket, a chilling realization washed over her. The zipper of the jacket was completely fastened all the way to the top. Clara never took her jackets off by pulling them over her head. If she had fallen into the water and drowned, the jacket would still be on her body. If she had taken it off before falling, the zipper would be open. The jacket hadn't just fallen off in the water. It had been carefully zipped up and deliberately placed on that branch. Someone had staged the scene, and Clara was nowhere to be found. Beatrice stood in the damp, crowded command tent, her eyes locked on the zipped-up yellow windbreaker resting in the plastic evidence bag. Her mind was racing, trying to process the impossible logic of what she was seeing. She looked up at Detective Thorne, her voice trembling but surprisingly firm. She explained how Clara always wore her jackets. She pointed out that if her sister had slipped and fallen into the raging river, the jacket would either still be wrapped around her body, or the zipper would have been torn open by the sheer force of the current tearing it off her shoulders. It made absolutely no sense for a drowning woman to carefully unzip her jacket, take it off, and then zip it entirely back up to the collar before letting it float away to catch on a branch. Detective Thorne listened quietly. He was a veteran investigator who had seen dozens of wilderness accidents. He gently explained that rushing water behaves in unpredictable ways. The violent swirling currents of the river could twist and pull clothing in ways that seemed impossible to recreate. He told Beatrice that people in a state of sudden shock or hypothermia often do strange things, sometimes even trying to remove their heavy clothing to stay afloat. He wanted to be compassionate, but he clearly believed this was a tragic, straightforward accident. A city girl, unfamiliar with the slick, mossy rocks of the Tennessee mountains, had simply gotten too close to the edge. But Beatrice knew her sister. Clara was terrified of deep water. She didn't even like swimming in a pool, let alone walking near the edge of a violent mountain river at dawn. Something felt wrong, really wrong. As Beatrice stepped out of the tent to find her parents, she saw Julian standing near the edge of the woods. He was surrounded by a few local deputies and a search and rescue volunteer. Julian looked completely devastated. He was sobbing, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking heavily. When he saw Clara's parents, he practically collapsed into her mother's arms, weeping loudly and apologizing over and over again. He kept saying that he never should have left her alone, that he just wanted to surprise her with her favorite blueberry muffins from the town bakery. Beatrice watched him closely. There was a knot of dark suspicion forming in her chest. Julian's grief was loud. It was incredibly vocal and dramatic. But as Beatrice looked at his hands gripping her mother's coat, she noticed they were entirely steady. When a person is truly in the grip of hysterical panic, their body shakes. Their hands tremble, but Julian's hands were rigid and still. When he briefly lifted his head and made eye contact with Beatrice, his crying seemed to pause for just a fraction of a second. His eyes were red, but they were remarkably alert. He quickly looked away and buried his face again. Over the next 5 days, the search for Clara Linwood became a massive operation. The story of the beautiful young bride vanishing on her honeymoon caught the attention of the local media, and soon, news vans were parked all along the gravel road leading to the cabin. Helicopters chopped through the crisp autumn air, flying low over the river canopy. Tracking dogs were brought in from neighboring counties, sweeping miles of dense forest. Search and rescue divers, wearing thick insulated suits, braved the freezing, turbulent waters, feeling blindly along the rocky riverbed for any sign of Clara's body. The Linwood family lived in a state of agonizing suspension. They rented a cheap motel room in the center of town, unable to sleep, barely able to eat. Clara's father, a strong and usually stoic man, seemed to age 10 years in a single week. He spent hours standing at the police barricade near the cabin, just staring into the dark tree line, waiting for his daughter to walk out. Clara's mother sat by the motel phone, jumping every time it rang, praying it was a hospital or a rescue team calling with a miracle. Beatrice spent her time asking questions. She begged Detective Thorne to let her see the cabin. She needed to understand what Clara's final morning looked like. Finally, on the 6th day of the search, after the forensics team had cleared the property, the detective agreed to let the family inside to collect Clara's personal belongings. Walking into the cabin felt like stepping into a tomb. The air was stale, smelling faintly of wood smoke and Clara's vanilla perfume. The living room was perfectly tidy. A jigsaw puzzle of a mountain landscape was half finished on the coffee table. Clara's favorite books were stacked neatly on the nightstand. But as Beatrice walked through the rooms, that same chilling feeling of wrongness crept over her again. She looked by the front door. Clara's heavy, waterproof hiking boots were sitting neatly on the welcome mat. Beatrice frowned, her heart beating a little faster. She turned to Detective Thorne, who was standing quietly by the doorway. She asked him what shoes Clara was wearing when she supposedly went walking by the muddy river. Thorne checked his notes. According to Julian, Clara had slipped on a pair of white canvas tennis shoes because she was only planning to walk a few yards behind the cabin to take photos. Beatrice stared at the boots. It had rained heavily the night before Clara vanished. The ground outside was thick with dark, slippery mud. Clara was obsessively neat. She hated getting her clothes dirty, and she would never wear thin white canvas shoes to walk through cold mountain mud. It was a small detail, but to Beatrice, it screamed that Julian's story was a lie. She quickly walked into the bedroom and opened Clara's suitcase. It was perfectly organized, just the way Clara always packed, but something was missing. Clara's camera case was sitting empty on the bed. Julian had told the police that Clara went down to the river specifically to take photos of the morning mist. If that was true, where was the camera? The police divers hadn't found it in the river. The tracking dogs hadn't found it in the woods. Beatrice brought this up to the detective. Thorne admitted that the missing camera was a mystery, but he reasoned that if Clara had fallen into the fast-moving water, the heavy camera could have easily sunk to the bottom and been wedged beneath a boulder or swept miles downstream. It wasn't enough to prove foul play. The police had already thoroughly checked Julian's alibi. They had driven the route from the cabin to the town bakery. It took exactly 22 minutes. Julian's receipt from the bakery was time-stamped at 6:42 in the morning. Several witnesses, including the bakery owner, remembered seeing him. He had been polite, ordered coffee and muffins, and seemed perfectly normal. He drove back, arriving at the cabin shortly after 7. The timeline was extremely tight. There was barely any window for him to have harmed Clara, staged a scene at the river, and still made it to the bakery with a calm demeanor. Furthermore, the cabin showed absolutely no signs of a struggle. There was no blood, no broken furniture, no defensive wounds on Julian's hands or face. To the local police, Julian Vance was just a grieving husband whose wife had suffered a terrible accident. They had no physical evidence to suggest a crime had even taken place. By the 8th day, the massive search operation began to scale back. The divers were exhausted, the tracking dogs had lost the scent, and the weather was turning bitterly cold. The local sheriff held a press conference, officially shifting the case from a rescue mission to a recovery operation. They believed Clara had drowned, and that the river had simply carried her away. That evening, Julian came to the family's motel room. He looked exhausted, his clothes wrinkled and his eyes hollow. He told Clara's parents that he couldn't take the pain of staying in the mountains any longer. The silence of the woods was driving him crazy. He said he was going to drive back to Michigan to start making funeral arrangements, even though there was no body to bury. He hugged Clara's weeping mother, shook her father's hand, and then turned to Beatrice. When Julian stepped forward to hug her, Beatrice froze. She let him wrap his arms around her, keeping her own arms firmly at her sides. As he leaned in close to her ear, she could smell his cologne. He wasn't crying. His breathing was completely steady. He held the embrace for a long moment, and when he pulled back, his eyes met hers. There was no sorrow in his expression. There was only a cold, empty stare that made Beatrice's blood run like ice. He turned around and walked out to his car, leaving them behind. The Linwood family refused to leave. They stayed in Tennessee for another 2 weeks, organizing civilian search parties, walking the riverbanks themselves, and handing out flyers in every surrounding town. But the mountains kept their secrets. Clara was simply gone. If you want more emotional cold case stories like this, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Eventually, running out of money and completely broken by grief, the family had no choice but to return home to Michigan. The drive back was suffocating. The silence in the car was heavier than it had been on the way down. They were returning without their daughter, without a body, without a single answer to help them find peace. A month after the disappearance, the Tennessee police officially boxed up the rest of Clara's personal belongings and mailed them back to the Linwood house. When the large cardboard box arrived on their front porch, Clara's mother couldn't even look at it. She locked herself in her bedroom, unable to face the physical reminders of her lost child. It was up to Beatrice to open the box. She sat alone on the living room floor late one evening, a pair of scissors in her hand. She cut the heavy packing tape and slowly opened the cardboard flaps. Inside were the ordinary, heartbreaking fragments of Clara's life. Her hairbrush, still holding a few strands of her blonde hair. Her makeup bag. Her favorite sweaters, neatly folded and sealed in plastic evidence bags. Beatrice went through the items one by one, tears streaming down her face. She picked up Clara's travel purse, a small brown leather bag she had carried everywhere during the wedding preparations. Beatrice unzipped it, intending to empty the contents into a smaller memory box she was creating for her parents. She pulled out a tube of lipstick, a pack of mints, and a few loose coins. Then she reached her fingers deep into the lining of the purse. She felt something hard and cylindrical tucked into a tiny zippered pocket at the very bottom. Beatrice pulled it out and held it under the living room lamp. It was a small black canister of 35mm film. Beatrice frowned, wiping her tears away. Clara's camera was still missing. The police assumed she had it with her when she fell into the river, but this was a spare roll of film, and it hadn't just been tossed into her purse casually. Wrapped tightly around the small plastic canister was a piece of hotel stationery from their wedding night. Beatrice carefully peeled the paper off. The paper was completely blank, but Clara had written something directly onto the black plastic of the film canister itself. Using a red marker, Clara had written 3 words in small, hurried handwriting. "Hide this, Julian." Beatrice's breath caught in her throat. Her hands began to shake so violently she almost dropped the canister. Clara hadn't just left a random roll of film in her bag. She had actively hidden it, and she had specifically written her new husband's name next to a warning. Something had happened before they even reached the cabin. Clara had seen something, or documented something, that she was terrified Julian would find. Beatrice stared at the small black cylinder, her heart hammering against her ribs. The police had completely missed this. They had treated the purse as standard personal property and shipped it home without looking deeply inside the pockets. Beatrice knew exactly what she had to do. The answer wasn't in the river. It was inside this canister. But as she sat in the quiet, empty living room, staring at her sister's handwriting, Beatrice realized that if she developed this film, she might uncover a truth far more dangerous than an accidental drowning. The very next morning, Beatrice did not go to work. She had barely slept a wink, sitting on her living room floor with the small black film canister gripped tightly in her hand. As soon as the sun came up, she drove to a local pharmacy that had a 1-hour photo processing lab. Her hands were shaking so badly, she almost dropped her car keys on the pavement. She handed the canister to the clerk behind the counter, paying extra for the fastest processing time available. The 60 minutes she spent waiting felt like a lifetime. Beatrice paced the aisles of the pharmacy, her stomach tied in agonizing knots. She kept replaying the words written on the film cylinder in her head. "Hide this, Julian." Clara was a rule follower. She respected authority, she never kept secrets, and she certainly never kept things hidden from the people she loved. For her to write a desperate warning on a piece of hotel stationery meant she was truly terrified of her new husband. When the clerk finally called her name, Beatrice practically snatched the paper envelope from his hands. She hurried out to her car, locked the doors, and tore the envelope open. There were only 12 pictures in the stack. Beatrice flipped through them quickly, her heart pounding. The first few photos were completely mundane. They were taken at the wedding reception. One was a beautiful family photo of Clara, Beatrice, and their parents standing near the cake. Clara looked radiant, though looking closely, Beatrice could still see that same lingering tension around her sister's eyes. The next few pictures were blurry, moving shots taken from the passenger seat of their rental car as they drove south toward the mountains. Then came the final 2 photos. They were taken inside the Tennessee cabin. The first was a picture of the living room fireplace, with Julian's boots resting on the hearth. But the final photo in the stack made Beatrice's breath catch in her throat. It was a wide shot of the cabin's living room. It had been taken using a camera's self-timer, resting on the coffee table. Clara and Julian were sitting side by side on a heavy plaid sofa. Julian was looking directly at the camera, smiling brightly. His arm was wrapped around Clara's shoulders, pulling her tight against his chest. But Clara wasn't smiling. She looked pale, exhausted, and incredibly small. Her eyes were fixed on the camera lens with a blank, hollow expression. The flash of the camera cast deep, heavy shadows against the wooden walls behind them, making the room look dark and oppressive. Beatrice studied every single millimeter of the photograph. She looked for a weapon in the background. She looked for packed bags, signs of a struggle, or anything that proved Clara was in physical danger. But there was nothing obvious. It just looked like a dark, slightly uncomfortable photo of a tired bride and her overly enthusiastic husband. She took the pictures straight to the local Michigan Police Department. A sympathetic officer scanned the images and immediately faxed them down to Detective Thorne in Tennessee. Beatrice waited by the phone for 3 days before the detective finally called her back. His voice was gentle, but the words he spoke were completely devastating. Thorne explained that while the warning written on the canister was unusual, it simply wasn't enough to prove a crime had been committed. He told Beatrice that in the eyes of the law, looking unhappy in a photograph is not evidence of a murder. He suggested that hide this could have meant anything. Maybe Clara had bought a surprise gift for Julian and wanted to hide the receipt. Maybe the film contained photos of a gift she didn't want him to see yet. Without a body, without a weapon, and without any physical signs of violence at the cabin, the police's hands were tied. Julian Vance's alibi held firm. He had the bakery receipt, the tight timeline, and the witness testimonies. The local authorities officially ruled Clara's disappearance a tragic drowning accident. Julian was cleared of any wrongdoing. The days turned into months, and the months quietly bled into years. The massive search operation in the Smoky Mountains was dismantled. The news vans drove away, the yellow police tape was taken down, and the world slowly moved on from the story of the missing bride. Julian Vance collected a modest life insurance policy that Clara had through her library job. A few months later, he packed up his house in Michigan, changed his phone number, and moved across the country to Arizona. He severed all contact with the Linwood family, leaving them completely behind in the ashes of his tragedy. Over the next 2 decades, the heavy weight of unanswered questions slowly dismantled Beatrice's family. The house that was once filled with laughter became silent and cold. Her father, consumed by the need to find his daughter, spent all his retirement savings hearing private investigators who found absolutely nothing. He passed away from a massive heart attack in 2010. Her mother followed just 4 years later, passing away in her sleep. She died with a broken heart, never knowing what truly happened to her eldest child. 26 years passed. It was now the winter of 2024. Beatrice was 52 years old. She had never married, having spent her entire adult life caring for her grieving parents and tending to the quiet ghosts of her past. She lived entirely alone in her childhood home in Grand Rapids. She spent her weekends slowly sorting through decades of accumulated belongings in the attic, preparing to finally sell the house and move on. But there was one box she could never bring herself to throw away: the large cardboard box from the Tennessee Police Department. One quiet Sunday afternoon, Beatrice was sitting at her dining room table. She had recently purchased a high-end, professional digital scanner. Her goal was to digitize all of her parents' old physical photo albums, hoping to create a memorial video to preserve the good memories of their family before the tragedy broke them apart. She spent hours carefully scanning childhood photos, holiday portraits, and old report cards. Finally, as the winter sun began to set outside her window, she reached into the heavy plastic tote bin beside her chair. She pulled out the small paper envelope from the local pharmacy, the same one she had ripped open 26 years ago. She took out the stack of 12 photos. The glossy paper had slightly yellowed with age, but the images were still intact. Beatrice felt a familiar, heavy ache in her chest as she looked at Clara's face in the family photo from the wedding reception. She gently wiped a speck of dust from the print and laid it face down on the scanner glass. If you want more emotional cold case stories like this, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Beatrice continued scanning the road trip photos, saving them into a digital folder on her computer. Finally, she picked up the last photo, the dark, eerie picture of Clara and Julian sitting on the plaid sofa inside the mountain cabin. She placed it on the glass and pressed the scan button. Back in 1998, the small 4x6 print had been muddy and grainy. The shadows in the corners of the room were just solid blocks of black ink. But modern technology was entirely different. The powerful digital scanner worked in ultra-high resolution. As the image rendered on Beatrice's large computer monitor, the scanning software automatically adjusted the exposure. It lifted the heavy darkness, sharpened the blurred edges, and pulled out hidden details that had been buried in the shadows for over a quarter of a century. When the fully enhanced image popped up on her screen, Beatrice felt a strange, icy shiver run down her spine. The picture was incredibly clear. It was almost like looking through a window directly into the past. She could see the texture of the plaid sofa. She could see the slight tremor of fear in Clara's tight posture. She could see the rigid, controlling way Julian's fingers were digging into her sister's shoulder. Beatrice placed her hand on the computer mouse and began to slowly drag the image across the screen, zooming in on the background of the cabin. She had looked at this photo 1,000 times over the years, but never like this. She looked at the kitchen counter behind the sofa. She saw a pair of sunglasses and a set of car keys. She panned the image over to the closed curtains on the left. Then, she scrolled over to the far right corner of the living room, a section of the photo that had always been completely black on the physical print. Sitting on a small wooden stand in the corner was an older model, boxy television set. In the original photo, the television screen had just looked like a small glowing square of white static. But on the high-definition, brightened scan, the image on the screen was perfectly clear. It wasn't static. It was a live television broadcast. Beatrice leaned closer to the monitor, her eyes widening. Her heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. The television was showing a local news program. Across the bottom of the screen, a clear red banner displayed a breaking news headline. Beatrice's breath hitched in her throat as she read the text. It was a local Tennessee news report about a major traffic accident on Interstate 40. But it wasn't the news headline that made Beatrice freeze in her chair. It was the bright white timestamp glowing perfectly clearly in the bottom right corner of the news broadcast. Beatrice pushed her chair back, her hands trembling so violently she knocked her coffee mug off the desk. It shattered on the floor, but she didn't even blink. She just stared at the numbers on the screen. The timestamp on the television read, Wednesday, October 13th, 9:15 p.m. For 26 years, Julian Vance had sworn to the police that Clara went missing at dawn on Wednesday morning. He claimed he had spent the entire daylight hours of Wednesday frantically searching the woods alone, finding nothing, before finally calling the police in the middle of the night. But this photo destroyed everything. Clara was sitting right next to him on that sofa on Wednesday night. Julian's entire timeline was a fabricated, calculated lie. And Beatrice now had the undeniable, crystal-clear proof staring her right in the face. For a long, agonizing moment, Beatrice could not breathe. She sat frozen in the soft glow of her computer monitor, the shattered pieces of her coffee mug resting on the hardwood floor near her feet. She just kept staring at the bright white numbers floating in the bottom corner of the television screen. Wednesday, October 13th, 9:15 p.m. The timeline of her sister's final day completely shattered in her mind, rearranging itself into a terrifying new reality. For 26 years, Julian Vance had maintained the exact same story. He claimed he left the cabin before sunrise on Wednesday morning to buy breakfast. He claimed that when he returned around 7, Clara had already vanished. He claimed he spent the entire daylight hours frantically searching the woods alone. The local police had based their entire investigation, their search grid, and their ultimate conclusion on that exact sequence of events. But this photograph proved it was all a lie, a calculated, incredibly cold-blooded lie. Clara had not wandered off into the woods at dawn. She had been sitting right next to Julian on that plaid sofa, inside the locked cabin over 14 hours later. The bakery receipt time-stamped at 6:42 in the morning wasn't an alibi. It was a prop. Julian had gone into town, made sure people saw his face, made sure there was a paper trail of his morning coffee, and then he had returned to the cabin. And for the rest of that day, he had kept Clara inside. Beatrice zoomed in on Clara's face again. The sheer psychological terror of what her sister must have endured that day washed over Beatrice like ice water. The cabin was miles away from the main road. It had no neighbors, no landline phone that could dial out without a calling card, and no cellular service in the deep mountain valley. Julian had the only set of car keys. He had trapped her there. Clara had always been gentle, but she was incredibly smart. At some point during that long, terrifying Wednesday, Clara must have realized that she was never going to leave that mountain alive. She had realized that the man she married was a monster, and that he was actively setting the stage for her disappearance. She knew she couldn't outrun him in the dense, freezing woods. So she did the only thing she could do. She gathered evidence. Beatrice realized with stunning clarity that Clara had orchestrated the photograph on purpose. She had suggested taking a self-timer photo, pretending she just wanted a memory of their first night in the cabin. Julian, arrogant and completely unaware, had smiled for the camera, thinking it was just a harmless picture. But Clara had deliberately positioned the camera on the coffee table at the perfect angle to capture the television in the background. She had waited for the local news broadcast to display the time and date. She was documenting her own proof of life. After the flash went off, Clara must have quietly removed the film roll in the bathroom or when Julian looked away. She had desperately scribbled the warning on the hotel paper, rolled it tightly, and shoved it deep into the lining of her purse, knowing Julian wouldn't search her makeup bag. She had outsmarted him in her final hours, leaving a silent scream for help wrapped in a black plastic cylinder. Beatrice didn't sleep that night. By 7 in the morning, she was on the phone. She knew she couldn't call the local county sheriff's office in Tennessee. The men who had worked the case in 1998 were likely retired, and they had already proven they were easily manipulated by Julian's tears. Instead, Beatrice called the headquarters of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, specifically requesting the Cold Case Homicide Division. She was transferred to Special Agent David Miller. Miller was a sharp, meticulous investigator in his late 40s who had a reputation for untangling decades-old mysteries. At first, he listened to Beatrice with the polite, guarded patience that detectives usually reserve for grieving families. But the moment Beatrice emailed him the high-resolution digital scan of the photograph, his entire demeanor changed. He called her back less than 10 minutes later. His voice was completely serious, stripped of all polite formalities. He told Beatrice to pack a bag and fly to Nashville immediately. The case was officially being reopened as an active homicide investigation. When Beatrice arrived at the massive concrete building of the State Bureau the next afternoon, Agent Miller was waiting for her. He led her into a sterile, brightly lit conference room. Spread out across a large metal table were dozens of old cardboard files. They were the original police reports, crime scene photos, and witness statements from 1998. Miller pointed to the digital printout of the enhanced photograph pinned to a corkboard on the wall. He told Beatrice that she had just handed them the holy grail of cold case evidence. The timestamp completely destroyed Julian's legal immunity, but as Miller explained, they still had a massive problem. They still didn't have Clara, and without a body, a defense attorney could argue the photo was somehow doctored, or that Clara had simply run away later that night. They needed to find out exactly what Julian did between 9:15 Wednesday night and 2 in the morning on Thursday when he finally called the police. They had a window of exactly 4 hours and 45 minutes. Miller and his team began tearing through the old files, looking at everything through the lens of the new timeline. They re-examined the photographs of the yellow windbreaker found snagged on the branch. It became painfully obvious that Julian had walked down to the river in the dark, zipped the jacket up, and carefully placed it in the water to create the illusion of a tragic accident. Then, Agent Miller found the detail that blew the case wide open. He was reading through a dusty, yellowed copy of the rental car agreement from the local airport. When Julian had returned the rental car a week after the disappearance, the police had briefly checked it for blood or signs of a struggle. They found nothing, but the report included the vehicle's final odometer reading. Miller calculated the distance from the airport to the cabin, the distance from the cabin to the town bakery, and the distance to the local police station. He added it all up and compared it to the final odometer reading on the rental contract. There were 42 unaccounted miles on the vehicle. In 1998, Julian had smoothly explained this away. He had told Detective Thorne that he had driven wildly up and down the mountain roads for hours on Wednesday afternoon, desperately searching for his missing wife before finally giving up and calling the police. The original detectives had completely accepted this explanation. It fit the profile of a panicked, grieving husband. But with the new photograph, they knew Julian hadn't been searching for anyone on Wednesday afternoon. He had been sitting on the sofa watching television. Those 42 extra miles had not been driven during the day. They had been driven late Wednesday night, deep into the darkness, while the rest of the mountain was asleep. Agent Miller stood in front of a large map of the county. He picked up a red marker. 42 miles round trip meant Julian had driven exactly 21 miles away from the cabin, and then 21 miles back. Miller placed the tip of the marker on the cabin's location and drew a precise circle with a 21-mile radius. The circle stretched far outside the official search grid used in 1998. The original tracking dogs and rescue divers had spent weeks combing the dense woods and the river directly behind the property. They had never looked 21 miles away because they had no reason to believe Clara had ever left the cabin grounds. Agent Miller and his team began analyzing the perimeter of the red circle. Most of the boundary fell within thick, impenetrable national forest where a rental sedan could never drive. Some of it fell within populated suburban neighborhoods where a man digging a grave in the middle of the night would be instantly spotted. But on the far eastern edge of the circle, sitting exactly 21 miles from the cabin, was a large, empty tract of land. Agent Miller pulled up the property records from 1998. It was an abandoned residential development project called Whispering Pines. The project had gone completely bankrupt in the mid-90s. The developers had cleared hundreds of acres of trees, poured several massive concrete foundations for luxury homes, and then run out of money. The site had been left entirely abandoned, surrounded by chain-link fences and overgrown weeds, miles away from any major highway. Julian Vance was a construction contractor. He knew how to navigate active job sites. He knew what abandoned foundations looked like, and he knew that deep, muddy trenches dug for plumbing lines could remain untouched for decades if a project went under. The room went completely silent as the horrifying reality set in. Julian hadn't thrown Clara into the river. He had driven her to an abandoned construction site in the dead of night, buried her in the dark, and then driven back to the cabin to stage the yellow jacket by the water. He had orchestrated the perfect crime, confident that the police would be so focused on the raging river they would never look at a failed housing development the next county over. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. By sunrise the next morning, a massive convoy of state police vehicles, forensics vans, and heavy excavation equipment was driving down a forgotten dirt road toward the abandoned Whispering Pines development. Beatrice rode in the passenger seat of Agent Miller's unmarked SUV. Her hands were gripped tightly together in her lap. She felt physically sick, her heart pounding a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. After 26 years of staring at closed doors, she was finally going to find her sister. The abandoned development looked like a graveyard of concrete. Huge, cracking foundation slabs were swallowed by decades of thick ivy and tall wild grass. The area was immense, covering nearly 50 acres. Finding a single burial site after nearly 3 decades felt like searching for a needle in a massive, overgrown haystack. But Agent Miller's team was equipped with technology that the original detectives couldn't have even imagined. They unloaded several ground-penetrating radar machines, slowly pushing the heavy carts over the dirt and concrete, scanning the deep layers of earth beneath them. For 6 grueling hours they found nothing. The sun climbed high into the sky, beating down on the overgrown concrete. Beatrice stood near the edge of the site, watching the technicians work in complete silence. Doubt began to creep into her mind. Maybe Julian had driven somewhere else. Maybe the math was wrong. Maybe her sister was truly gone forever. Then, just past 2 in the afternoon, a sharp, repetitive beep echoed across the desolate site. One of the radar technicians waved his arm in the air, signaling to Agent Miller. They had found an anomaly. It was located deep beneath a section of earth that had once been dug out for a basement, but had slowly filled with mud and debris over the years. The radar screen showed a distinct disruption in the soil layers, about 5 feet down, indicating that the earth had been violently disturbed and then packed back together long ago. Agent Miller ordered the excavation crew to move in. They did not use heavy machinery, terrified of damaging any potential evidence. Instead, a team of forensics officers in bright white coveralls began to dig by hand. The sound of metal shovels cutting through the dense, heavy clay echoed through the quiet afternoon air. Beatrice moved closer, standing just behind the yellow police tape. She couldn't take her eyes off the digging. Every scoop of dirt removed felt like a weight being lifted from her chest, replaced instantly by a suffocating wave of dread. She was finally going to know the truth, but the truth was going to break her heart all over again. After an hour of careful, methodical digging, one of the officers suddenly stopped. He dropped to his knees in the dirt, shining a bright tactical flashlight down into the deep trench. He called Agent Miller over. The air felt heavy, as if the entire world had just stopped spinning. Agent Miller looked down into the dark earth. He slowly reached his gloved hand into the mud and carefully pulled something out. He wiped the heavy clay away with his thumb, holding the object up into the fatting afternoon sunlight. Beatrice gasped, a sharp, broken sound escaping her lips. Her knees completely gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto the wet grass, covering her face with her hands as tears finally poured down her cheeks. Gleaming dully in the harsh light, entirely unmistakable even after 26 years in the ground, was Clara's heavy silver locket. The sight of the silver locket resting in Agent Miller's muddy hand completely shattered whatever fragile wall Beatrice had been holding up inside her mind. She knelt in the damp, overgrown grass of the abandoned construction site and wept until her lungs ached. The loud, broken sound of her crying echoed across the empty concrete foundations, carrying 26 years of unbearable grief, exhausted hope, and unimaginable heartbreak. Agent Miller gently climbed out of the deep trench, walked over to Beatrice, and placed his heavy jacket around her trembling shoulders. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just stayed right beside her as the reality of the moment finally set in. They had found her. Clara was no longer lost in the dark. Over the next several hours, the forensic excavation team worked with extreme care and absolute reverence. As they slowly cleared away the heavy clay, they uncovered Clara's remains. The scene in the earth perfectly preserved the tragic truth of what had happened on that cold October night. The investigators found Clara exactly as Beatrice had suspected. She was not wearing the heavy, waterproof hiking boots Julian claimed she had put on for a morning walk. She was still wearing her thin white canvas tennis shoes. But the most devastating discovery was found buried just a few inches away from her remains. It was Clara's missing camera. The heavy plastic casing had been smashed, completely crushed by the violent strike of a shovel, but Julian had carelessly tossed the broken pieces into the grave to hide the evidence. He had known the camera was dangerous, but he had no idea Clara had already removed the single roll of film that would ultimately seal his fate. The medical examiner arrived on the scene as the sun began to set. Even after more than 2 decades, the forensic evidence was undeniable. Clara had not drowned. There was absolutely no water in her lungs, and no sign of a tragic slip on river rocks. The examination revealed distinct trauma to the back of her skull. She had been struck from behind, quickly and violently, completely stripped of any chance to defend herself. Agent Miller walked back over to Beatrice, who was sitting quietly on the bumper of his unmarked vehicle. He looked at her with a fierce, uncompromising determination in his eyes. He told her that he had enough evidence to put Julian Vance away for the rest of his natural life. He promised her that the man who destroyed her family would never spend another day as a free man. 2 days later, a joint task force of federal agents and local authorities quietly surrounded a sprawling, beautiful suburban home in Scottsdale, Arizona. Julian Vance had built a remarkably comfortable life for himself over the last 26 years. He was now 54 years old. He drove an expensive luxury car, belonged to a private golf club, and lived in a neighborhood filled with tall palm trees and perfectly manicured lawns. He had remarried, started a successful contracting business, and completely erased the terrified young bride he had buried in the Tennessee mud. He believed he had committed the perfect crime. He believed the past was dead. It was a bright, sunny Tuesday morning when Julian walked out of his front door, carrying a leather briefcase and adjusting his expensive sunglasses. He didn't even make it to his driveway. Agent Miller stepped out from behind an unmarked van, flanked by 4 heavily armed federal agents. They moved in swiftly, cutting off any avenue of escape. When Miller called out Julian's name, Julian stopped dead in his tracks. For a fleeting second, the charming, confident mask slipped from his face, revealing a flash of absolute panic. But he quickly recovered, forcing a confused, polite smile as he asked the agents if there had been some sort of misunderstanding. Agent Miller didn't smile. He stepped right into Julian's personal space, pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt, and looked the man directly in the eye. Miller told him there was no mistake. He told Julian that they had just returned from a failed housing development called Whispering Pines. At the mention of that name, all the color instantly drained from Julian's face. His arrogant posture collapsed. He didn't fight back. He didn't scream or deny it. As the cold metal cuffs clicked securely around his wrists, his hands finally began to shake. Later that evening, inside a sterile interrogation room in Phoenix, Julian Vance sat at a metal table, staring blankly at the wall. Agent Miller walked into the room, carrying a thick manila folder. He didn't shout. He didn't pound his fists on the table. He just calmly sat down across from Julian, opened the folder, and placed the digitally enhanced photograph of the cabin living room squarely in the center of the table. Julian looked down at the image. He stared at his younger self, smiling brightly on the plaid sofa. Then his eyes drifted to the background. He saw the television set. He saw the bright white timestamp glowing on the screen. Wednesday, October 13th, 9:15 p.m. The silence in the interrogation room was incredibly heavy. Julian's breathing became shallow and fast. He was looking at impossible proof of his own lies. Agent Miller leaned forward and finally laid out the entire, horrifying truth. The investigators had dug deeply into Julian's financial records from 1998, uncovering the dark secret he had killed to protect. In the months leading up to the wedding, Julian's construction business was quietly collapsing. He had secretly embezzled thousands of dollars from his clients, and he was facing imminent exposure, completely drowning in debt. He saw Clara not as a partner, but as an easy, naive target. Just 5 days before their wedding, Julian had secretly forged Clara's signature on a massive life insurance policy. It was a comprehensive accidental death policy, designed to pay out over $500,000, with a specific clause covering wilderness accidents. Agent Miller explained exactly what had happened in that cabin. Clara had always been meticulous and highly organized. Sometime on that long, rainy Wednesday, while unpacking their bags or looking for a pen, she had found Julian's hidden financial documents stuffed inside his heavy leather briefcase. She found the forged life insurance policy. She saw the staggering debt notices. In that terrifying moment of discovery, Clara realized the man she had just married did not love her. He was planning to murder her. Julian realized she knew the truth. The tension in the cabin escalated into a silent, suffocating hostage situation. Julian wouldn't let her leave. He wouldn't let her use the car. He kept her trapped inside the wooden walls as the sun slowly set, waiting for the cover of darkness to execute his plan. But Clara was incredibly brave. Knowing she was trapped, knowing she likely wouldn't survive the night, she decided to fight back the only way she could. She suggested taking a picture, using the camera timer to capture the television screen in the background. She created an unbreakable alibi for her own timeline, documenting her proof of life to destroy his carefully crafted story. She hid the film canister in her purse, wrote a desperate warning on a scrap of paper, and trusted that her sister would eventually find it. Julian stared at the photograph, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and quiet defeat. He had spent 26 years thinking he was the smartest person in the room. He believed he had orchestrated a flawless deception. But in the end, he had been entirely outsmarted by a terrified 24-year-old woman who simply knew how to leave a breadcrumb for her family to follow. Faced with the undeniable timestamp, the forensic evidence from the gravesite, and the recovered financial documents, Julian's defense completely crumbled. The arrogant contractor who had easily lied to the police, the media, and a grieving family for 2.5 decades finally broke. He accepted a massive plea deal to avoid a lengthy, highly public trial. He pleaded guilty to first-degree premeditated murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never walk free again. A month after the arrest, Beatrice finally brought her sister home. It was a cold, quiet morning in Michigan when the small, beautiful wooden casket was lowered into the ground at the local cemetery. The autumn leaves were falling, covering the green grass in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, looking exactly like the day Clara was married. Beatrice stood by the gravesite, wrapped in her heavy winter coat. The cemetery was incredibly peaceful. She watched as Clara was finally laid to rest, buried in a beautiful plot right next to their mother and father. The empty space that had haunted their family plot for 26 years was finally filled. Their family was whole again. As the final words of the service were spoken, Beatrice reached into her pocket and pulled out the heavy silver locket. The forensics team had carefully cleaned the dirt and mud away, restoring the silver to its original, beautiful shine. Beatrice held it tightly in the palm of her hand, feeling the cold metal warming against her skin. She closed her eyes, taking a deep, steady breath. For the first time in her adult life, the crushing weight of anxiety and unanswered questions was completely gone. The nightmare was over. There are some secrets that people believe they can bury forever. There are dark deeds hidden deep in isolated woods, locked away behind charming smiles and carefully fabricated lies. People like Julian Vance believe that if they just dig a hole deep enough, the truth will eventually stop breathing. But the truth is incredibly patient. It does not forget. It waits in the shadows, resting in the quiet lining of an old leather purse, waiting for someone brave enough to keep looking. Clara Linwood lost her life in those dark mountains, but she never lost her voice. She reached across time, across decades of silence, to protect her family one last time. And in the end, love proved to be vastly stronger than any lie ever told.